So as an introduction to Bull as an organization, what we're going to go through is that time to move beyond traditional perimeter security to defend against ransomware. And as we go through the session today, that should become a bit clearer of why I've named the presentation that, for example. So as an introduction to Bull as an organization, we're headquartered and founded in Denmark. And we've actually broken out of an organization called the NC3, which is the National Cybercrime Center over there. So similar to the NSA in America or the NCCU in the UK. And what our technology is on a really high level is a 24/7 automated containment solution. So as currently within your environment, as you would have technologies from an endpoint protection, antivirus, firewall rules to block the threats in the first place, if something within that perimeter layer was to be circumvented or bypassed one way or another, our solution would kick in very, very quickly to contain that encryption attack within the environment. And just to set the scene again, why this presentation today is called to move beyond traditional perimeter security is based on the recent announcement we're seeing across lots of different government organizations, whether it's the FBI in the US, specifically looking at healthcare organizations, or from a public sector perspective in the UK. But also when the G7 had their last meetup last month, quite interestingly, they had their discussion of global issues across the economy. And obviously, the number one issue would have been the COVID pandemic on how it's affecting the global industries. But also very high up on their agenda was ransomware. And one of the key points they made around that, and you can see in the statement, was that fact that companies need to maybe think of a different way that they're approaching cybersecurity from a ransomware perspective, and how they need to move beyond that traditional perimeter security. And this is very interesting to us as BullWall as an organization, as it's exactly what we do with our technology. And if we just highlight a few of the recent attacks that we're seeing, and specifically within the financial and banking world, we've got the likes of Finestra, who supply a lot of software to the financial industry. About 90% of all global banks are using this technology. They suffered their ransomware attack earlier in the year. In recent weeks, we've seen the likes of DBS and also the Chilean bank Banco Estado, who again, the knock-on effects with the closure of some of their branches on a global scale and the knock-on effects that's had to their customers. And probably the most high-profile case we've seen, the likes of Travelex. Obviously, that was back on New Year's Eve last year, but the high impact of that case being around 32 days of downtime, estimations of around $250 million to $300 billion. And as you can see on the screen, back in August this year, it's actually forced that billion-dollar organization to be forced into administration. So it just shows the knock-on effects that these sorts of cyber attacks can have on the financial world. But not just from an end-user banking organization, whether you're using a third-party supplier from a managed service provider perspective, and that some of the likes of Cognizant, Conduent, DXE, for example, that didn't just have technologies within their portfolio, but also offering this to their customer base. And again, you can consider the knock-on effects that would have across their personal security, but also their customers as well. And all of these cases I've mentioned have a lot of different things in common. They're obviously large organizations and they've had these high-profile attacks, but also they would have had other things like a lot of investment within IT and specifically security. They may have had a dedicated IT security team, lots of budget to procure a lot of the solutions you can see on the left-hand side. And if we look at this wall on the left-hand side, we've got that best practice when it comes to security. You've got your email scanners, your web filtering, your firewalls, your antivirus. But again, we're still seeing the same area repeat itself on a global scale. And the RC technology fits exactly here. Not a replacement tool, a very complementary and an additional layer of security that you won't have security in place at the moment. It's that point your prevention solutions have failed or been compromised, and that encryption attack is now spreading within the environment very, very quickly. And I'll show later in the presentation of how we do that. But to first set the scene of what we see on a global scale across every organization is this kind of attack surface and that external traffic that's coming into the organization. And that, again, that layered approach, whether it's having a web gateway, a corporate firewall, email scanners, and also that endpoint protection layer of security, whether it's your antivirus, your next-gen antivirus, your endpoint detection and response tools to again combat all of these ransomware attacks. But the point of this slide is just to highlight how all of these different prevention solutions essentially are being circumvented by the cyber criminals and how they're becoming a lot more advanced. So the first thing the cyber criminals will do once they're actually they've gained access to your network is to start that reconnaissance process. They'll understand from a financial perspective what they could get away with demanding, leaving that on the ransom note so you can actually pay that to get your data back. What they'll also do is understand where your key data resides within the organization, and again, using that as the first point of encryption to again cause the most damage within the environment. But in the latest strains of ransomware, quite interestingly and quite scarily, we're seeing they're even going into the IT services that are being run by an organization and potentially disabling things like antivirus or endpoint protection, or even your backup synchronization. And it's giving the IT security world a lot of false sense of security, where the technologies they thought may have blocked that threat in the first place aren't even enabled at that point of encryption. And just to highlight again from another angle that they're taking is obviously from a base level of security, you've got the patch management you need to address, closing the vulnerabilities across your operating systems, your applications within the environment. But on the top left-hand side of the screen, we can see certain techniques and bypass methods being used by the cyber criminals. One of them we've shown here called replace bypass. Essentially, this was 2 lines of code being injected within a vulnerability within Windows 10. That was enough to bypass their protection from ransomware perspective, but also circumvent a lot of the well-known antivirus and endpoint protection solutions. And you can see on the screen, only the likes of Kaspersky and Carbon Black actually made modification to their software to prevent this vulnerability from being used. And that leads very nicely onto that critical time gap, or that advanced zero-day threat we need to consider. And essentially, every time a new ransomware strain has been introduced to the wild, essentially to an organization, the same picture repeats itself. 0 out of 58 vendors, as you can see on the top right-hand corner, have protection in place, whether they need to make modifications to their software, relevant updates, or update their known signatures, for example. It's again that arms race against the cyber criminals of how you can protect quick enough to block that threat. And if we look at that in a live example, what we've got here is one called Maze Ransomware, which is probably one of the most active strains at the moment. It's affecting a lot of organizations. And as you can see on the screen, even after a 2-week period, 14 days, only 15 vendors from an endpoint protection, an AV perspective, had this protection in place in the first place. And again, you've got some quite large names on the bottom half of the screen that still haven't made that relevant update within their tool. But the issue with this is it's not just the end users that have access to monitor this and what tools are blocking what threat. We're also having the cyber criminals monitoring this, understanding is their variant being blocked by a certain vendor, and then if they are, they'll just change around the code within that ransomware strain, release a new variant, and we'll go back to square one. That picture we saw on the last slide of 0 out of 58 vendors being protected. And after those first few slides, it's now posing that question, is that 100% prevention? Is that going to work 100% of the time? And again, we're not a rip and replace technology. We're a value add in an area all of these other security vendors are not looking at. But the first point I'll note on this slide is we're not advocating to have all of these different endpoint protection tools in place. 1, it will be a lot of repetition, and 2, it will be quite expensive to actually install. But just to highlight, they're all susceptible to similar ways of being circumvented or bypassed one way or another. And what I can do now is simulate the traffic or that data, which is essentially what the cyber criminals are looking to take control of and actually encrypt. So what we can simulate is a virus coming in from the left-hand side, bypassing the firewall, compromising a user's device one way or another. What that's going to do very, very quickly is going to head straight to the file shares to start to encrypt your data, and perhaps replicate onto other machines to even speed up that process further. And going back to that first slide of all of these organizations that have been hit by ransomware, this is the picture they would have seen. All of their servers, all of their desktops, all of their file shares are very much not operational. And this is where we see that downtime and costly recovery time for organizations. But if we rerun this simulation, but in this scenario, we have RC installed from a server perspective, And if the virus comes through, it bypasses the firewall, it compromises a user's device, again, it will head straight to the file shares. But because with RC, we don't care about the entry point of that ransomware attack, it's more looking at the data within the organization. So again, that firewall, that user's been compromised, but as soon as we start to see any form of illegitimate encryption within your crown jewels data, we can very quickly put a response plan in place. And as you can see on the screen, we've got one user that's been isolated off the network. They will suffer a little bit of downtime, but the whole organization is still very much operational. And just to highlight all of these different vendors within specific areas of security and how this has moved from your traditional network, your endpoints, your application level, to now a lot broader area of IT. And especially during the COVID pandemic with potentially working from home scenarios and instead of one office, you've got hundreds or thousands of offices to consider. And with the introduction of things like mobile security, personal devices being used to access corporate data, lots of use of cloud support tools like Office 365 and SharePoint, and even aspects such as IoT security, and things like even a security camera or a multifunction printer, because they're still connected to the internet, we've seen those as that entry point for the cybercriminal to start the attack. But obviously we've got a lot of vendors on this slide, but also what the cybercriminals are looking at is that attack surface and attack vectors to essentially look to penetrate your organization. And again, it's posing that question from an IT perspective. How many prevention tools do you need to install to say you are protected against ransomware? Is it 4, 5, 6, 7 different technologies before you say you can actually block all of the threats? So that's why Bull will have a very different analogy and concept around ransomware. And all of those technologies from a prevention perspective, if we group them into that first line of defense, on a high level, what they're looking to do is that identification and also that protection. So as that network traffic, external traffic comes into the organization, it's essentially going to make a judgment decision. Is that traffic good? We can allow it onto the network and essentially run, or is it bad and we look to block it? And again, they block a lot of the ransomware attacks we see, but what if they made a mistake? What if that did turn into a ransomware outbreak within your environment? That's when you need to look at a last line of defense, a tool like RC, to contain it very, very quickly. So what we provide with this 24/7 automated containment solution is a 4-step, essentially toolkit to deal with that encryption process. The first point again, and I'll highlight again how that's different to the prevention tools, is we do need to see some encryption happen. We're not looking to block the threat, but very quickly, as soon as we see that buildup of illegitimate encrypted files, very quickly we'll send out a response plan accordingly. So within the response plan, there's twofold to that. So the first aspect of that will be we can isolate a user's device. We could remove a user from Active Directory. We could drop a VPN connection, maybe from a home worker or a satellite office within your environment. Or we could even disconnect or revoke their SMB share permissions from a cloud perspective as well. And again, it's containing that user away from the crown jewels data of the organization. In conjunction with that, there'll also be a lot of different alerting mechanisms within the tool. So whether it's having an SMS or an email alert being generated, integrating it to a SIEM solution to alert you, or even having an alarm going off in your IT department to give you that control back. And quite an interesting statistic about that notification side is 63% of all breaches recorded last year were notified by the end user and not by technology. And if we think about that from a global scale, the billions of dollars being spent on cybersecurity, it's still that end user that's the first point of notification for an environment. So with our tool, you get that control back within IT of what's actually happening to your data. From the third aspect is more of the analogy of damage limitation. How quickly can we stop this ransomware strain from spreading within our environment? And keeping in mind a ransomware strain at the moment will start to encrypt files at a rate of about 10,000 files every minute. And again, if that notification was maybe on a Monday morning, but that encryption attack was triggered off at Saturday at 2 a.m., for example, by that first point of notification, there's a good chance your whole data infrastructure is likely to be encrypted. So what we do with RC is limit that encryption to a handful of files, whether that's 10, 20, 30 files, and the ability to pinpoint that to one individual within the organization. That list of encrypted files, again, can be exported to CSV format, so linking to your backup strategy, whether it's Veeam, TCS, or Datto, for example. You can get that one user back up and running in a matter of moments, and you don't have that prolonged downtime to consider. And now moving on to the fourth point, which is more linked to the compliance aspect of, especially as a ransomware attack moves to a ransomware outbreak, which now could potentially lead to a data breach. If within those encrypted files there is personal identifiable information, it's something you still need to report to from a GDPR compliance perspective. And considering with the newer strains of ransomware, the ability to understand which files are even encrypted in the first place, and you have that 72-hour time frame, it's going to be a very difficult task to achieve. So what we do with RC is automatically generate a report after every incident. And what you get is the key information you need to stay compliant from a GDPR point of view. So you can customize this document with your company logos. Maybe the data protection officer or the CISO of the organization can have their credentials at the top. And then you have a breakdown of the timestamp of when the attack started, when it stopped, and then go into the key detail of the file owner, their IP address, and again, that full list of encrypted files. And this process is all automated. So going back to the example of Travelex, instead of that 32 days of downtime and then the prolonged recovery perspective, in a matter of moments, you haven't just detected a ransomware attack's happened, you've put your response plan in place, you've already kicked off your recovery process, and you've already got your compliance report ready to go. So what we actually see across all of our customers when we do our initial engagements is we ask these few questions, and we get to have good answers to all of them. And this is a scenario-based slide where we're now considering within your own environment, if a ransomware outbreak was to take place. So this is your antivirus, your firewalls, your EDR, your endpoint protection has failed at this point in time, and your data is now starting to be encrypted at a very rapid speed. So the first questions to consider is, can you understand which files are being encrypted and where they actually reside within the organization? Are they on-premise? Are they in Azure? Are they in AWS? Has the attack been initiated from SharePoint, Office 365, Google Drive, for example? The second point is to identify patient zero. So which user within the organization has actually initiated that encryption attack on your environment? Which users potentially opened that malicious email to start that encryption process, and it's actually turned out to be a malicious ransomware? If you can't pinpoint answers to question 1 and 2, the ability to go and actually stop that ongoing encryption is going to be very, very difficult if you don't know where it started. And again, that's the key point. If we think about the files being encrypted at a rate of 10,000 files a minute, we need to act quickly on this. And that's what we can cover with RC. The fourth and fifth point are more linked to your restoration plan, your procedures around your backup tools. But just keep in mind, a few of the other strains of ransomware we're seeing are even going after your backup copies as well. So it puts a big question mark on that restoration time within your environment. And the fifth point, again, as we've mentioned, you have that 72-hour window. Do you feel that you can stay compliant if there has now been a data breach off the back of that ransomware outbreak, and you now need to report this? And again, these are the 5 key questions that our solution can automate for you as part of that response plan. So just to highlight from an architecture perspective within the tool, there's a few really key points to note. So what we're going through today is obviously all done remotely, hosted by Ronsim and Anna. But in terms of, if we look at this from a proof of concept or even a full installation of the product, all of this can be done remotely, all online, and there's no need for us to step on site during these times at the moment. But a few of the key points around the technology itself is we're actually an agentless technology. So there's nothing to physically roll out across your desktops, your laptops, your tablets, your file servers, your storage platform, for example. All we are is one VM in the data center, and that's enough to cater for thousands of users. As an example, we have a customer in the United States that has over 20,000 users, global locations. They're running off that one VM. So it's a very scalable solution. In terms of when we're actually monitoring the data within an organization, we don't require write access to the storage platform. It's purely read only. So again, you're there safe from a compliance perspective. But when we're looking at this when we're monitoring the traffic, it's based on file event notifications. And this is quite a unique feature to the tool, as we're not recursively scanning your network, and we don't actually add any additional network overhead to what you have at the moment. So there's no issues from a performance perspective on your network either. To put this in an example, if a user within your organization is in a shared folder, within a shared file, and they look to modify or create or delete or rename a file, what that does, based off of the Microsoft technology of SMB and CIF protocol, that's going to send a network broadcast up. Within the technology, we have the ability to look at the heuristics of that file change, understand if that file change is legitimate or illegitimate. And again, the buildup of illegitimately encrypted files is when we can put our response plan in place. And that exact same methodology applies. There's no agent to be rolled out. We don't recursively scan the network, but from a cloud perspective, you might tailor the response slightly different. So if a user is on the corporate network or they're on a VPN connection, we can still physically see that device. So we can still put the steps in place to isolate their machine to contain the attack. But let's say if a user is working from home on a personal device or in a hotel lobby or on public Wi-Fi, for example, if they started to get encrypted locally on their PC, based on that synchronization process of Office 365, those encrypted files are going to start to be synchronized up to the cloud. So what we can do with our enterprise Office 365 cloud connector is intercept that traffic as it's being uploaded to the cloud and put steps in place to again contain that attack from actually spreading any further. So in that scenario, what we could do is revoke that user's SMB permissions. We could remove the user from Active Directory. So again, they don't have access to that crown jewels data of the organization. And again, one user may be infected, but the whole organization is still very much operational. And just to highlight how we are very well integrated into organization, the first point around alerting, so whether it's via our own alert methods or even a third-party tool to do that. You can also have a mobile phone view of the solution. So if you were out of the office, you could have this view on your mobile phone. These notifications could also be created via things like email or WhatsApp, SMS alerts, or even having that alarm going off to again give you that control back of what's happening to your data. And if you do have any other technologies within the environment, so anything from a network access control solution where we could see the alert being generated and you could use a third-party solution to actually quarantine the device, you could use our technology that way. Also, if you have maybe an event management tool, a SIEM solution, for example, we could see the alert, we could quarantine the device, and we could also send an alert with the event logs up to those third-party solutions to do that further analysis. So from the presentation and overview for today's session, that's what I wanted to show. What I'd like to just jump onto briefly is our actual technology, and I'll just do a 5-minute demo to show you what we can actually do. So this is the dashboard of the solution, and what we can simulate is that data traffic. And based on those file event notifications, this is existing traffic on your network. So the top left-hand corner in itself is really good data. This is good data. There's nothing being illegitimate, so we're not going to look to isolate a device. But as an example, if we went to a user's PC and they were in a folder within a file share, and what we've got here is only 37 items that we can actually initiate an attack to. Within your environment, you may have terabytes worth of data. So just to show the speed we can look to encrypt, if we just manually renamed an extension, for example, to quite a well-known ransomware strain called WannaCry, if we change that file type document straight away based on that SMB and CIF protocol, we're able to intercept that as that broadcast is being made. Straight away, you can see an event log being created of a known bad extension within the environment of .WannaCry, and you've got the exact location and what file share that's attacking. But because this is only one file being renamed manually, we're not going to start shutting devices down, but you have that control back. Straight away, you can see it's a known bad extension, but you've also got the ability to identify which user's done that. So at this stage, you could go to John Doe, you could provide some awareness, you could provide some information around the WannaCry ransomware strain, so he stops doing that to documents around the extension. But we're not going to start shutting a device down. We've only had one file, and we'll slowly go back to 0%. If we briefly just go back to the desktop, and what we've got here is a simulation tool, and we can actually use this as part of an assessment or a proof of concept with this technology to do a test of an encryption attack within your environment. And interestingly, with .WannaCry, it's quite easy to see which files are encrypted as the extension's been changed. But the newer strains of ransomware are going into the document, changing around the bits and the bytes, introducing a new file header, but the file name is actually staying the same. And that's exactly what this DMA locker strain will do. So if we agree to this ransomware, what we can see is the speed we're able to react. Straight away, as we click OK, encryption, the process of encryption is taking place. Straight away, you can see on the screen that device is now in the proceeds of shutting down and isolating. If we go back to the dashboard, again, we can see we've hit 100% alert stage. We've put that isolation step in place and we've contained that attack. But the key information is we have had to see some files being encrypted, and we've got that breakdown straight away on the dashboard here. And again, you've got the ability to see a known bad file headers being introduced, but also we've seen it was John Doe within the organization that's been compromised after the attack. And the final thing I'll go through is just from a recovery perspective. So we've contained the attack, which is great, and we've stopped it from spreading. But what we can do now is end the alert. We can now highlight all of the traffic we've simulated on today's webinar, but we know the user that's been compromised is John Doe. So we can see it's only 9 files that have actually been encrypted as part of this ransomware simulation. You can then select those files. You can export that to CSV, so linking that to your backup strategy, and you're kind of ready to go from a recovery perspective. But from a compliance point of view, you now need to consider, is there personal information included within these 9 encrypted files? If there is, you need to report this from a GDPR perspective, and we can assist with a minor or a major data breach report. Straight away, this is populated with all the key information you need to report to the relevant governing bodies of what's actually taken place, with the timestamp, an overview summary, and again, the breakdown of what we've seen from the attack. So from today's session, that's kind of an overview of what we do. We do have a booth today. If you want further information, please stop by. But at this stage, I'll hand back to Anna for the next presentation.